Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm In Jung Cho. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol quickly revoked his martial law order after a motion by the National Assembly. Today we discuss what this means for South Korea's democracy and its alliance with the U.S.
국회의 계엄 해제 요구가 있어 계엄 사무에 투입된 군을 철수시켰습니다.
Korea is one of the most powerful stories in the world about the emergence of democracy and democratic resilience.
President Yoon badly misjudged. People were prepared to come out and make clear that this was a deeply illegitimate process.
In the studio with me, Mr. Sidney Seiler, Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Seiler was a former National Intelligence Officer for North Korea on the National Intelligence Council from 2020 to 2023. Mr. Seiler was the Special Envoy for Six-Party Talks and National Security Council Korea Director during the Obama administration. Mr. Seiler also served as Senior Analyst for U.S. Forces Korea. Mr. Seiler has worked on North Korea issues for over 40 years. Also joining us, Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner spent 20 years at the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency and served as CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, Mr. Klingner, what is the long-term impact of President Yoon Suk-yeol's declaration of martial law on Korean politics and its democratic system? And even if South Korea has advanced democracy, is there a chance they could always revert back to authoritarian era?
I think the implications will be mixed. Most importantly, it'll show that South Korea's constitution was upheld, that democracy has taken hold firmly taken hold in South Korea, and that the system worked. At the same time, I think there will be a perception that South Korea is not yet a mature democracy, that first-tier mature democracies don't declare martial law except for dire military situations such as an attack or an invasion by North Korea. So I think President Yoon's reputation is the one certainly at risk, but South Korea, I think, indirectly will have their reputation besmirched to some degree. I don't think, though, that there's a danger of reverting to authoritarian rule. Certainly we saw the very quick reaction by the National Assembly and by the populace, that there was very strong demonstrations, and we've seen very high public opinion polls against what President Yoon did, and also very high approval for impeachment of President Yoon.
Now, Mr. Seiler, South Korea achieved democracy in the late 1980s. Deputy Secretary Campbell said that martial law brings out, because of the previous experiences, it brings out deep and negative resonance in South Korea. How do you think the latest declaration of the martial law is the same or different from previous cases?
You know, at a certain level, it's a secondary question to the fact that this was an egregious miscalculation on President Yoon's part to think that he could use the parameters provided in the Constitution for declaring martial law to take the action that he did. Second of all, I first arrived in Korea in 1982, a few years after a martial law had been declared. Chun Doo-hwan had seized power through coup d'etat. There's an apple and orange dimension to it. In other words, in no way am I condoning the events that took place, but they're very different from back then. That said, the Korean people do have memories of those days, of what it was like when speech and gatherings were restricted and clamped down on, when political freedoms were suspended, and the law was manipulated to seize power. So I think that really speaks to why this action was so shocking in terms of how President Yoon sought to address a political challenge he was facing with a deadlock in the National Assembly, frustrations in getting legislation through and getting the budget passed, frustrations in the constant efforts to try to impeach members of his government. That frustration can be understood, but the action in no way can be condoned.
Mr. Klingner, the extreme polarization in Korean politics, second impeachment attempt in 8 years, and then also a declaration of martial law, and then also the extreme confrontation between the opposition and the ruling parties. Do you think these all undermine South Korea's democracy?
I don't think so. It shows perhaps that it's a messier democracy than other nations. But in the long term, again, I have a mixed view. It's not a setback for South Korea's democracy in that the system prevailed, the Constitution was upheld, an extra constitutional action was put down. But there's also that sense that in a democracy, a president shouldn't be invoking the constitutional clause that allows declaration of martial law for things other than a major emergency. The initial statements by President Yoon, or at least the initial reporting, seemed to suggest unidentified groups that were trying to overthrow the government. I was thinking that there was some evidence or intelligence that indicated that there were groups, about to storm the bastions of power. Then in the formal declaration, it was solely directed at his frustration with the opposition, and that, they have the majority in the unicameral legislative system, and it's not what President Yoon wants. He's clearly frustrated with not being able to move forward on his agenda, which he feels he had a mandate for, that he was elected for. But to resort to martial law because of a frustration with a majority opposition in a democracy is not the right move, and clearly is extra constitutional. And needs to have serious consequences against President Yoon for such action.
So President Yoon, the unidentified forces that you talked about, specifically President Yoon said they are pro-North Korean and anti-state forces. What do you think of his contention that there's subversive forces in Korea that need to be rooted out? There were past instances where there were North Korea-linked espionage suspected cases that were revealed.
Well, if there are such forces, he needs to provide convincing evidence, either before taking such serious action or certainly afterwards. It does run the risk, however, of what would be called red baiting or McCarthyism, of simply having legislators or the part of the populace that advocate policies which are what North Korea would like to be implemented does not necessarily make them pro-North Korea or Korean forces. So, if a policy is that they want to be conciliatory towards North Korea, reduce or eliminate sanctions, eliminate U.S. military exercises, certainly that's what Pyongyang would like. But advocating that does not necessarily make them agents of North Korea, or the pro-North Korea is a bit of a loaded term. It could be policies that North Korea would like, but not necessarily that you're an agent of influence or you're on North Korea's payroll. So if there are subversive forces, then you need to identify them and present the evidence before you take either legal or extra constitutional actions.
Now, if you take a step back, and let's look at what's happened over the past few years. And the North Korean threat to South Korea has increased markedly. And that's why we had this extended deterrence crisis, as it were, over the past few years, where confidence in the U.S. commitment to the ROK and the security of the Republic of Korea has really come into question. And the progress that we've made in countering these developments in terms of resuming U.S. military exercises, carrying out extended deterrence strategic capabilities, shows of force, launching the nuclear consultative group, maturing the coordination, launching trilateral cooperation. All these things are opposed by factions within South Korea who believe that we should be sitting down with North Korea, seeking peace, seeking reconciliation, not antagonizing North Korea, not provoking North Korea with our exercises and our launches. And so if you're responsible for the security of Korea, which the president is in his position, and you particularly have this the conservative view of the North Korean threat, you can see the frustration or the concern that these forces are out to stagnate the domestic agenda and oppose the foreign policy objective. So, and again, as Bruce said, none of this justifies the declaration of martial law, because what's absent is the clear and present danger, the sense that the North Koreans are ready to cross the border right now, and as soon as they roll across the DMZ, we'll find out who all the North Korean agents in the National Assembly are. We don't have that.
And Mr. Seiler, the presidential office has defended the martial law declaration as strictly within the constitutional framework. The United States values democracy and the rule of law. How would the United States react to claims that President Yoon's declaration of martial law to the subsequent revocation is within the legal boundaries and does not have legal flaws?
Well, I pivot again to what Deputy Secretary Kurt Campbell, the term he used, is serious miscalculation. The legality of the actions will certainly be debated. Already President Yoon has sought to say that what he did in both invoking and then pulling back the martial law was according to the constitutional steps as defined. And as much as Bruce says, and he's right, that, there's no really clear and present danger apparent, there is a degree to which that can be a subjective call. Sid Seiler and Bruce Klingner might not think so, but Yoon Suk-yeol as president might have thought so. But other than that, whether it was taken according to the Constitution or not, I'm sure will be part of the discussion in the days and weeks and months ahead. But again, is a really secondary question and what will become apparent going forward is something that we've seen in past cases. Park Geun-hye impeachment comes immediately to mind. It's not so much the letter of the law as much as the minshim, right? Public opinion or the heart of the people that needs to be reflected. And I think that will play into this going forward, so that the legal argument almost appears ridiculous to be having.
If either North Korea did a major attack or where there was sufficient intelligence indicating an imminent attack, then that would seem to be justification for declaring martial law either before a major North Korean action or shortly thereafter. The third part of Article 77 would be, a national emergency, domestic issues, and that's a bit more subjective. But again, the evidence that President Yoon has provided seems to be frustration with legislative gridlock, as opposed to evidence for, preparation for massive attempts to overthrow the government.
Now, I want to move to how this incident affects U.S.-South Korea alliance. Mr. Seiler, Deputy Secretary Kurt Campbell said President Yoon badly misjudged and called it deeply illegitimate process. NCG meeting was canceled, and reportedly Secretary Austin also scrapped his South Korea trip. Do you sense a sense of frustration from the Biden administration and they were not notified earlier on?
I think, first of all, there was an immediate shock of the events, and Kurt's characterization of this as a miscalculation, again, is right on. And so it caught everybody by surprise. The natural response would be to do what we've done, which is do a stand down on diplomatic events. It's both, it's got a punitive dimension and just a pragmatic dimension. It would be hard to justify any high visibility bilateral interactions at this point, at least while these political events still are not fully resolved. There will be a point, obviously, that again, the relationship is much greater, to quote the State Department spokesperson, I think from yesterday or the day before. The relationship transcends any particular president. The United States and the ROK have such institutionalized starting with the 28,500 troops on the peninsula, the Combined Forces Command, such institutionalized realms of cooperation and coordination that I think the longer term impact of these events will be very small. And again, you're talking to somebody who's, lived through the Park and Hay impeachment, some of the beef incident, and the two teenage girls accidental death incident. These things come, we address them, and then we overcome them, and then go forward. And I have no reason to believe that won't be the same in this case.
And Mr. Klingner, Mr. Seiler said because of practical reasons, it is difficult to have high visibility meetings, bilateral meetings at this point. Out of the same reasons, wouldn't it be difficult for United States to promote South Korea as the beacon of democracy to other countries at this point, for a time being?
Well, there are going to be short-term complications and difficulties in U.S.-South Korean relations, but the long-term relations will remain strong and in both of our self-interests. So clearly an action like President Yoon's goes against the Constitution, it goes against democracy, and it's one that the United States can't condone. And then it's almost a diplomatic question of how strongly do you criticize it? Some would advocate we should sever relations with the Yoon administration, that we have to strongly criticize this action. We can, sever not only diplomatic meetings, but other actions. On the other hand, South Korea is a critically important military ally, economic partner, and diplomatic partner on the world stage. So we can't just, toss a grenade in the punch bowl and sever relations. So it's a difficult situation of how strongly to criticize President Yoon's actions. Certainly, they are a heinous action that should not only not be condoned, but should be criticized. But then we also, sort of the unsatisfactory part of diplomacy is you have to deal with, the long-term issues that remain constant despite the turnover in administration. So the U.S. had relations, diplomatic relations, economic relations, military relations with the military dictators in South Korea, with the authoritarian rulers. So there are sometimes a clash between strategic interests and advocating on behalf of democracy.
So you're saying even if the martial law continued, the United States would not have strongly criticized South Korea or condemned it or do any alliance-altering actions because you talked about how United States maintained relations with authoritarian regimes in the past?
I think there would be a difference between the public statements by the administration and private actions by the president, by the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the U.S. Ambassador, Commander, U.S. Forces Korea, et cetera. A lot of what goes on between Washington and Seoul would be behind the scenes. There would be very harsh messages, and I'm sure they were sent on Tuesday. So you don't always do your diplomacy publicly. So, just as when the U.S. was trying to urge South Korea and Japan to reconcile, there were stern private messages to both Seoul and Tokyo, but it was not done publicly. So I think when you're dealing with an ally, when you're dealing with a friend, a diplomatic partner, there's going to be a lot of very harsh statements privately, but you don't necessarily want to burn your bridges totally with a critically important country that you will want to maintain relations with regardless of who's in power.
And Mr. Seiler, if the martial law had been continued, then wouldn't that have impacted the forces in South Korea, U.S. forces, and their operations there?
There would adjustments would have to be made. There's a construct where now peacetime operational control of ROK forces does not fall under the commander of Combined Forces Command. So the U.S. 4-star doesn't have the ability to dictate the disposition of forces. He can't order them out of the barracks or back to the barracks. It's really a hypothetical that it's really hard to imagine because the martial law itself was so ill-justified. Maintaining it would have been exponentially more difficult than if we had this hypothetical situation where we had a clear and present danger that warranted it.
And Mr. Seiler, several U.S. former officials on this program said that they're not concerned so much about the chemistry and cooperation between U.S. governments and the Yoon government, but they were concerned about what happens after President Yoon. And the South Korea's 6 opposition parties in their impeachment motion claimed the Yoon government has antagonized North Korea, China, and Russia and pursued a strange foreign policy centered on Japan. Are there concerns in the United States about a possible pro-China, anti-United States, anti-Japan government in Korea if the Yoon government faces some political crisis in the near future?
So I would think an anti-U.S. Situation is very unlikely. The possibility that you would re-examine our coordination on trilateral cooperation with Japan, an effort by the ROK to seek some type of equidistance between Beijing and Washington so that it hedges, that there would be potential rolling back of strategic asset deployments, military exercises, and other military actions that would be seen as provoking North Korea. That would all be within the realm of what whoever, if it's Lee Jae-myung or somebody else, whatever, the voice is out there on these issues. And we know the criticism of the Yoon administration's foreign policy, and there is that risk that it would go the other way. But I can tell you, having worked on the policy side for changes of administrations in the ROK, that we always know that there's a possibility we could be working with a very like-minded, in terms of military issues, conservative government or an engagement-oriented progressive government. And U.S. policy is certainly flexible enough to tailor our approach, particularly on North Korea, China, and other global foreign policy issues, to tailor our approach to how we cooperate with the Republic of Korea. So we saw this during the 5 years of the Moon administration, during the Nomuhyun era, and certainly the Kim Dae-jung era. The high visibility progressive leaders, and we got through it. We had a good, solid bilateral relationship, and we were able to deal with these issues in a way that reflected the interests of the Republic of Korea and the United States.
Mr. Klingner, how would North Korea interpret the martial law declaration and ensuing political turmoil in South Korea? Would they misjudge, miscalculate, and do a provocative action, thinking that South Korea will only focus on domestic issues?
Well, there's always a danger of miscalculation on the Korean Peninsula. I think as former intelligence officers, Sid and I have gone through many nights and days of worrying about a situation that inadvertently can escalate to even a major confrontation. And the initial question many had during the events of the martial law was, will North Korea attack? And I say no. During the Gwangju incident of 1980, there was massive demonstrations. There was much greater instability in the South Korean system. If any time was more conducive to North Korea attacking, thinking that the South Korean people would support a North Korean attack, that would have been the time. And they also didn't attack during the Park Geun-hye impeachment and all the massive demonstrations. So I don't think they would do a strategic major provocation or major attack. Now, people then said, well, what about tactical provocations? Well, they're doing that every day or almost every day anyway, and anything can be a provocation. And if they launch a missile tomorrow or on Tuesday, it would have seemed like, oh, that's related to martial law, but no, they're doing it anyway. So certainly the intelligence community, the military, both on Peninsula and elsewhere, is always very vigilant, looking for any indications of North Korean military action. And perhaps they're going to have an extra cup of coffee to be extra vigilant, just to keep track that North Korea won't do anything.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Mr. Klingner, Mr. Seiler, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.